Hello everybody and welcome to the EAZA Animal Welfare Webinar. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Sally Binding, I'm the EAZA Animal Welfare Coordinator, and we are joined by Sandrine Camus, who is behind the scenes on technical support. Sandrine is our EAZA Communications Officer, so if you have any problems, please do pop it into the chat function and hopefully she'll be able to help you from there. Please also do use the chat function for any questions that you might have. I'll be collating those and hopefully I will give as many of you the opportunity as possible to ask your questions to our speaker at the end of the talk. So please do use that, and apologies now if I don't get to everybody. Please make note that this webinar is recorded and will be available a couple of days' time, and you can access that via the EAZA YouTube channel and also via the EAZA website Animal Welfare page. And there you'll find all the previous webinars that have been recorded, and they are all free for you to download and view. So please do that, and please feel free to share them, and hopefully you'll be able to make use of them. Also on the website, you will find an animal welfare assessments library, which has been collated, which is a collection of animal welfare assessments, which has kindly been shared with us by their authors, and they've given us permission to put on our website, and you can download those again for free and hopefully apply them within your institution. So please do have a look at that. And I would also like to thank IFAW, which is the International Fund for Animal Welfare, for sponsoring these webinars and therefore allowing us to keep delivering them for free, and ensuring that everybody is welcome to join us. So I would now like to present and welcome to the webinar Associate Professor Ngaio Beausoleil. It's my honour that she's joining us today. Massey University, the University of New Zealand, where she's co-director and co-manager of the Animal Welfare Science and Bioethics Centre, which is the World Animal Health Organization Collaboration Centre. Her main research focuses are behavioural and physiological measures of welfare and how we can apply them, and the relationship between conservation and welfare science. She is a world-renowned animal welfare science. I'm sure many of you have already heard of her, and her co-authoring of the 5 domains papers have become the leading animal welfare framework. So thank you very much, Ngaio. We are very pleased to have you with us today, and enjoy the next hour, everybody, and I'll hand over to you, Ngaio.
Thank you so much, Sally. And I'd just like to start off by saying welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for having me. So I'm down in the most wonderful little part of the world right now where mostly we get to do what we want. We've just gone up one level of lockdown, which means that we can't meet with more than 100 people at a time. And I just said to Sally, I have no desire to do that. So I'm perfectly happy with my life right now, but I really feel for everybody and what you're going through in your parts of the world, and the trials and tribulations you're going through. So as we say in New Zealand, kia kaha, stay strong, and I hope things improve for everybody soon. So we are going to talk tonight, or today, wherever you happen to be in the world, it's tonight for me. We're going to talk about the 5 domains model. This is a model for assessing and for understanding animal welfare. It used to be called the 5 domains of potential animal welfare compromise. You can imagine that when it started to get used more, that became pretty cumbersome. And so nowadays we just sort of refer to it as the 5 domains model, and most people know what we mean. So what we're going to cover in the next 45 minutes or so, and I'm sorry to say, but you guys actually have to do some of the work today. So I'm a great believer in sharing the joy and the love. What I'm going to do is start off by talking about a little bit about the history of the 5 domains model. So how it came into being, and a little bit about how it has changed over about the last 25 years in which it's been in existence. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about how the model works, so how it's applied, what its structure is, and particularly for those who haven't been exposed to the model before. I imagine a lot of people have heard some kind of talk or have seen a presentation or read a paper about the model, but for those of you who are not familiar, we're going to talk a little bit about how it works. And then I'm going to send you off into groups and you will do a little exercise. So we'll talk about fish welfare today. And so you'll have about 10 minutes working in groups to do that, and then we'll come back together and I'll do a little bit of a debrief about how I would apply the model to come up with a decision in this situation. And if there are any other questions or you want to make comments about the exercise, you can do that in the Q&A session at the end. I want to then talk a little bit about some of the recent updates. So at the end of last year, we published the most updated version of the model, and there have been a few changes to the model that I want to just point out to you, and some of those might help explain some of the challenges you have with the exercise. I then want to spend a little bit of time talking about what's great about the model and why it's useful compared to some other commonly used models and frameworks. And of course, it's not perfect, so we'll talk a little bit about what the limitations are. And then I want to finish off by just pointing you to a most recent focus in the application of the model, and how we've really focused and made an explicit consideration of how interactions between humans and animals can influence animal welfare, and how the model now really helps you to tease those kinds of interactions and implications apart. And then we'll just finish up with a summary. And then you can ask questions or make comments about what we've talked about. So that's the plan for the next 45 minutes or so. I'll start off by telling you a little bit about the 5 domains model. So the model was developed by David Meller, and here's a picture of David in the corner. And many of you will have been exposed to David in some way and really have an understanding of what an amazing man he was and how much he's done for our field, not only animal welfare in general, but particularly zoo animal welfare. He's been absolutely fundamental to the wonderful things that the zoo community has done in terms of welfare over the last sort of 10 years at least. So the model was formulated by David and one of his colleagues, Cam Reed, in the early 90s. Unfortunately, Cam died a number of years ago, and it's impossible to even find a picture of him. So I unfortunately haven't been able to put a picture of him on the slide, much as I'd like to attribute the model to him as well. This model was really formulated in the context of using animals in research, testing and teaching. So it had a really specific origin in that area of animal use. And since that time, it's really exploded into a whole bunch of other areas where we interact with animals. So in 1993, it was developed. The following year, it was published in the proceedings of a conference we have, a group called ANZCART. So this is the Australia-New Zealand Council for the Care of Animals in Research and Teaching. And from there, it really sort of took off. About 3 years ago, it became an explicit part of the process that we have in New Zealand for getting approval to do scientific research with animals. So you have to apply to an animal ethics committee. You will all have something similar in IACUC or something like that. And the 5 domains became embedded in that process when people were having to explain how the research that they wanted to do might impact on the welfare of the animals. And as you'll see as we go along, at that stage, we were only really thinking about negative impacts on animals' welfare, and we were really only comfortable with talking about 5 or 6 particular negative experiences that animals might have. And I'll come back and touch on that a little bit in a few minutes. So from there, as I said, the model was really used in a whole bunch of different places. So we did evaluations of livestock animals, sport animals, and just interesting to note that recently Thoroughbred Racing New Zealand has taken the 5 domains model as sort of the conceptual basis of its welfare strategy, just like zoos did. And it's been used to assess the welfare of a variety of companion animals. So I've put here in blue in 2005, we started to use the model to evaluate the welfare of pest animals. For many of you, you'll probably know that New Zealand is a world leader in killing things. We spend a huge amount of time, energy and money killing pest animals that were introduced to New Zealand. And it became really important for us to understand what the impacts of our killing methods were on the pest animals. So I put that in blue because that's around the time that I started to become involved in the model. David was my PhD supervisor, and along with some colleagues in Australia, where they also kill lots and lots of things, we started to use the model for that purpose. In about 2012, that's when the zoo community really came on board, and many of you will know that EAZA uses the 5 domains as the basis for their welfare strategy, and lots of other regional zoo associations have followed suit, including the Australia-New Zealand Zoo and Aquarium Association, which uses the 5 domains as the basis for their whole accreditation scheme of their members. Recent things that we've done with the model. So last year, an Australian colleague used the model to try and assess the welfare of free living horses. So feral horses living in Australia proved to be pretty tricky actually, but we learned a lot through that process. Also last year, a paper was published using the model as the basis for forensic investigations of animal cruelty cases in the western part of Canada. So helping lawyers to create cases, prosecution cases against people who had mistreated animals, and likewise helping judges understand how they could support a judgment to convict those people. And then, as I said, we've also just published another version of the model that really expands on human-animal interactions, and we'll talk about the 4th domain quite a bit today. So that's what's happened. What I would like to talk about now is a little bit about how the model actually works. So there are a couple of premises, for those who aren't familiar with the model, there are a couple of premises that the model is based on. And the first one is that welfare is a state within the animal itself. So it is not what we do to the animal that influences its welfare state, but welfare is actually something within the individual animal itself. And the animal's welfare state most directly relates to all of the different mental experiences or emotions or feelings or whatever you want to call them that the animal has. In other words, the animal's welfare state is really about how the animal experiences its own world and its own life. And the second premise, which is really consistent with this, is that the model reflects the affective state orientation. So if you see here in the middle, we've got this domain 5, which is the mental experiences domain, and it's these mental experiences or the affective experiences, and I'll use this word as we go through. What I mean by affective experience is an experience that means something to the animal. It has some significance, it's either pleasant or positive, or it's unpleasant or negative. And it's those positive and negative experiences that we consider to have the most direct influence and give rise to the animal's welfare state. So the structure of the model is such that we actually separate things that are about the physical or the functional state of the animal and what the animal's brain interprets those things as in terms of its mental experience and what it means to the animal. So if we start off by having a look at the left side of this diagram here where it says physical or functional domains, this is where we have our 4 domains that relate to what's happening with the animal and its body. So we have domain 1, which is about the hydration and the nutritional status of the animal. We have domain 2, which is about its environment, and I'm going to come back and talk a little bit about how we've changed this name. We're not now talking about domain 2 as being the physical, or you might think of it as the sensory environment of the animal. We have domain 3, which is about the animal's health or its functional status, and this is where we would put information about any diseases that the animal has, any injuries that it has suffered, or any other functional impairment. So for example, if the animal has been poisoned or ingested a toxin, then evidence of that would go into domain 3. And then domain 4 here you can see is called behavior/interaction. As you'll see in a few minutes, we're now calling this one behavioral interaction because people are getting a bit confused. But this one is really about the animal's interaction with components of its environment, with its social environment, so other animals, and also with human beings as well. So really what the model does is it allows us to organize the information that we have in order to demonstrate that things are happening to the animal in its physical or functional domains. And so this, the 4 physical or functional domains on the left here is where we put the evidence that we have, and this would be things that we can measure or things that we can observe. So here we're talking about things like behavioral indicators, physiological indicators. We might be lucky enough to have information about what the animal's brain is doing, so some neurophysiological indicators. And we would also put pathophysiological information here too. So what's going wrong in the animal's body? Is there evidence of disease or injury? All of those things happening in the animal's body lead to its nervous system interpreting that sensory information and then ultimately generating some kind of mental experience. And so we use that evidence. Now, really important point here is that mental experiences are subjective. They have to do only with the individual person or individual animal. And that means that we can't measure or observe those mental experiences directly. And that's true if we're talking about another animal or if we're talking about another person. I can't directly know what your mental experiences are any more than you can know what mine are. But what we can do with other animals and what we can do with people is we can cautiously, and using the evidence that we have available to us, infer what those mental experiences are likely to be. And so that's what we do. We use the information that we've collated in these physical or functional domains to try and carefully infer in a justifiable way, following the small arrows here, what the mental experiences in domain 5 are likely to be. And remember that it's those mental experiences, both positive and negative, that we consider to be most directly relevant to the animal's welfare state. And that welfare state, so over here on the right-hand side, in the big box there, is based on the balance of positive and negative experiences happening at any point in time. And the animal's welfare state can range anywhere on a continuum from really poor at one end to very good at the other end. So that's really what we do with the model. Recently, I was looking at a policy that was developed by a veterinary organization, and I was a little bit horrified to see that there seemed to be a bit of a misunderstanding about the structure of the model and what it really represented. So I thought it was important just to make this clarification. The point that I want to make is that, and I thought this was kind of obvious in the model because of the arrows, but that's sort of a bit simplistic. The point that I want to make is that domain 5 is not separate from the other 4 domains. So what I saw in this document, unfortunately, and what I want you to know is not correct, is we don't talk about domains 1 to 4 representing or considering the animal's physical well-being, and then domain 5 representing or considering its psychological well-being. That would suggest that those are 2 different things. And according to the principles of the model and the orientation that underpins it, that's not what we consider to be correct. So for us, what we think is that the physical state of the animal, all of the things that are happening in its body, which are a representation of its physical state inside itself, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but also how it experiences its environment and what's happening outside itself, that information is interpreted by its central nervous system and gives rise to mental experiences. So domain 5 is inherently linked to what's happening with the animal's body, and that we put that information in domains 1 to 4. In other words, the animal's physical state and the behavioral interactions that it has give rise to those mental experiences. So they can never be separated because the mental experiences arise because of what's happening in the animal's body. So it's really important that, well, at least for me, that we don't talk about physical well-being and psychological well-being, because actually psychological well-being arises because of what's happening in the animal's physical state. Other people have different views on that, but that's the sort of fundamental idea behind the model. So I said at the beginning that over that period of about 25 years that the model's been in existence and has been used in lots of different areas relating to animals, that the structure has changed and we've added things to the model. And this has happened because there's been an evolution in our thinking and our knowledge and the evidence that we have available for the capability of different animals to have different mental experiences. So in the very first version of the model in 1993, as I said, we only felt comfortable talking about 6 different mental experiences, and they were all negative, because at that time we had a focus on reducing or avoiding negative experiences for animals to make sure that they had sort of acceptable welfare. So in that original list, we had thirst, we had hunger, we had pain, we had fear, we had anxiety, and we had this thing called distress. And it makes sense to think that those were the first negative mental experiences that people thought, yep, it's probably justifiable to say that many animals have those experiences, because if you don't have those kinds of experiences, then you won't survive very long. If you're not hungry, you won't seek out food. If you don't feel pain, you won't avoid danger in the future, and you won't allow your body to heal in the short term. So what you're seeing in front of you now is the version that was produced in 2009. So a number of years after that original version came out. This one's turned on its side compared to the other one, so we're actually working downwards. So you can see the 4 physical or functional domains at the top: nutrition, environment, health, behavior. And those lead into or give rise to the mental experiences that we put in domain 5, which is called mental state. Now you can see here that the list has started to expand. So we have a whole bunch of other negative experiences that we weren't comfortable with talking about in 1993 because we didn't really have evidence to support them. Now we have things like weakness and sickness and dizziness and breathlessness. And we also are starting to get into things like boredom and frustration because the evidence is starting to accrue that some animals at least can have those negative experiences. You see that they're all still negative, and you'll notice that this thing called distress is still here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a few minutes, so you'll maybe see why I've actually highlighted this thing called distress. The other thing you might notice is that some things feature in more than one of these lists. So we have pain, and we talk about short-lived pain. In the middle, we've got moderate pain, and on the right-hand side, we have persistent and untreatable pain. So as well as the quality of the experience, we're now starting to consider how long it lasts and or how intense it is, which tells us a little bit more about how it might impact on the animal's welfare state. Now, just to give you an example, and this is only one of the domains, so what I'm going to show you in a moment is domain 2. We haven't even got into the other ones, but this is really just to show you that in the latest version, we're now up to a much bigger number, so hundreds of possible experiences that animals might have. So just to explain to you what's going on here, so this is the physical, domain 2 about the physical environment. And you'll notice that we don't just have one column here now, we actually have 4 columns. So we've got on the left-hand side here, we've got negative conditions. And within that, we have what would be in domain 2 on the far left. And then aligned with those conditions, we have negative experiences or affects that might arise because of those conditions. So for example, we've got close confinement, which might lead to a feeling of stiffness or muscle tension. Remember, the evidence would go into domain 2, and then we infer what the mental experiences might be in domain 5. So here we've actually got domain 2 with domain 5 alongside it. On the right-hand side, we've got the same thing, but this is for positive conditions leading to positive experiences of various kinds. And I just want to make a note at this point, because some people might be feeling a little bit skeptical about some of the things that you see here. It's really important to note that we're not claiming that all animals have the capacity for all of these different experiences. It's up to the user to either use their own expertise or to find somebody who has expertise in the particular biology, ecology, and behavior of the animal that is under assessment, and to actually justify the mental experiences that are claimed for that particular kind of animal. So you might feel a little bit reluctant to conclude that cockroaches, for example, feel bored or that they feel lonely, and you would only put that into your version of the model if you could find some evidence to support that, usually in the scientific literature. So we really think about the model as a checklist, or as David always calls it, an aid memoir. It isn't everything that you would like to put in there, and it doesn't have to have everything for every single animal in every situation. It's really up to the user to select the things that are appropriate and to only include those, and to provide justification for including those in your particular version of the model. So this is just a generic version, so it's turned on its side again because I always find it's most useful and you can put more things into it that way, but if you feel like turning it the other way and that's easier, then by all means do that. What you'll see here is that structure represented again with the 4 domains, physical functional domains on the left, and in each of them in red we have problems or restrictions. So for example, in domain 1 we've got restrictions on food and water intake, or in domain 3 we've got disease, injury, functional impairment, and then we align with that specific negative and positive experiences in domain 5. So if you have restrictions on food and water intake in domain 1, that is likely to lead to the negative experience of hunger in domain 5. I just want to point out what's in domain 4 here at the bottom, because this is something you might need to think about when we do the exercise. So down in domain 4 at the bottom, you'll see this term called agency here. And you'll see that if the animal's agency is restricted by things like a barren environment or a monotonous environment or limited choices, that can lead to negative experiences like fear or anxiety or boredom or loneliness. And again, it's up to the user to sort of justify which of those you think that your animal is capable of experiencing. So really what we mean by agency in that situation is something that the animal really wants to do, behaviors that the animal is strongly motivated to do. If it's thwarted in its desire to express this agency, then it can lead to those negative experiences. On the other hand, if we give animals opportunity to express their agency, then they can have a range of positive experiences. So feelings of being in control, feelings of safety and security, or companionship if they can access animals or people that they want to. So in a moment, we're going to talk about the exercise, and these are just a few things that I want you to consider when you go into that exercise in your group. The first thing is, and this really relates to the structure of the model as it is now, is you need to think specifically about which mental experience is likely to arise. And this is kind of why I don't like distress, because distress actually is not a specific unpleasant experience. And the problem with using distress is we don't really know what it is, and we don't really know how to avoid it or fix it. So if you are looking at domain 5, I want you to really think about, okay, in this context with this evidence, either the animal's behaving in this way, or it's got high stress hormone levels, or it's avoiding me. Think about what the likely specific mental experiences are in that situation for that animal. The other thing is what I've said a couple of minutes ago. You really need to be able to justify your inference of mental experiences based on the evidence that you have. So those are the things that are observable and measurable, things like behavior, things like pathophysiology and physiology. That stuff goes in domains 1 to 4. Your inferences about mental experiences go in domain 5. And of course, look for evidence of both negative and positive experiences. And you'll see I've got a little twinkle here, and that's really to remind people that just providing an opportunity doesn't mean that the animal expresses its agency and has a positive experience. You need evidence that that opportunity has been utilized. So it's all very well to put a ball or some kind of proposed enrichment environment in an enclosure, but if the animal just sits there and looks at it and never takes advantage of it, then it's unlikely that you've got evidence of a positive experience. So bear that in mind as we're going along. Okay, so this is what I want you to do. So there in the chat function, if it's not there already, in a moment there will be a Word document which has everything in it that you need. If you decide you don't want to work in your group, then you're more than welcome to just turn your video off for a couple of minutes and do this exercise on your own, and then come back to the main room in about 10 minutes from when we leave. Essentially what the situation is that you are working in a zoo. A member of the public has complained about the zoo's policy of feeding live goldfish to the otters for the otters' behavioural enrichment. So this matter is referred to the zoo's Animal Welfare Committee, and they want to make an informed and transparent decision about whether they can keep doing this practice or whether they need to stop and do it in a different way. And so the committee has asked you as a group to come up with a decision, or at least an assessment of 2 scenarios. And really what I want you to be focusing on is the goldfish welfare. So I appreciate that ultimately we have to make a balance between the otters' welfare and the goldfish welfare, but just for this exercise, I want you to just ignore the otters, and I want you to base your assessment solely on the goldfish. While you're doing this, the things I want you to think about are, what specific experiences do you believe that goldfish can actually have, and why do you conclude that? What kind of evidence do you think you could use to support those conclusions about what goldfish can experience? And how might you link the behavioural and the physiological evidence, what you're going to put in domains 1 to 4, with what you put in domain 5? The other thing I want you to do, and this is a clue, is I want you to think about the whole entirety of the goldfish's experiences. So there is some information in the scenarios that gives you some hints, and I want you to sort of use as much of it as you can. Okay, so I'm now going to send you away for 10 minutes. You're going to disappear into breakout groups, and hopefully you'll get a reminder at about 1 or 2 minutes to come back into this group. If you decide to go and work on your own, can you please come back in 10 minutes from now? My clock says 32 minutes past whatever hour it is. So let's have everybody back at 43 minutes past whatever hour you're operating on. And we'll do a brief rundown of what you might get out of the model. And then again, you can ask more questions at the end. Okay, everybody. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to give you a sort of a brief rundown. We don't have a great deal of time. Just give you a brief rundown on the way that I might apply the model to have make a decision about these two different situations. So if we think about the first situation of live feeding, then we go through our 4 physical and functional domains and have a look at, oh, have I stopped sharing my screen? Yes, I believe I have. Hold on a second. Sorry about that. There we go. To think about what's going on in those different domains. So probably for the first domain about feeding, plenty of water around, so we don't need to worry about hydration, but probably for the first 2 domains of food and water and the physical environment, there's not too much to worry about for either scenario. So we probably don't need to consider either of those. If we think about feeding these animals to the otters, we need to think about all parts of the scenario that we've been given. So in domain 3, which is about health and physical fitness and injury and that sort of thing, there's a potential for injury to happen to those animals, both when they're being transported in the bucket to the otter enclosure and also when they're being chased by the otters, obviously. So we might think about a negative experience of pain associated with physical injury due to being snapped up by an otter in that in domain 3 and then in domain 5. A lot of what we're thinking about here comes into domain 4, the behavioural interaction. So the things that you might have considered there are things like the capture of the whole group of 20 fish from their tank and the transport process, which is about 2 minutes over to the otter's pond. So we might consider that the fish would experience, if they're able to, feelings of anxiety or fear due to being captured and transported in a novel bucket. The good parts about that, though, might be that they stay in their familiar group. They're not divided up from the 20 fish that they're used to living in. And then the question is, and I don't know the answer to this, is 20 a normal social grouping for goldfish? So if it is, then we might consider that there are some positive experiences for these animals in their normal day-to-day life. They get to live in a normal social group. They have an enclosure that provides opportunities for positive experiences. So they have hiding structures, they have plants, they might be able to engage in play, they can engage in exploration, and they can get away from aggressive conspecifics. So there might be some positive feelings there of things like engagement or feelings of comfort or safety. When they're in with the otters, obviously, they can't escape and they're chased. And so we would expect that there would be, if you believe that goldfish can experience fear, then there might be up to 10 minutes of fear for those animals. So the overall conclusion from that scenario I would make is that actually for these guys, their normal life is pretty good. They have some opportunities for positive experiences. And so life is pretty good up until the point that you become otter food. But there are probably a few minutes of fear or anxiety and potentially pain associated with being chased and caught by an otter. So that's that one. The other alternative is to actually get these fish and to feed them dead to the otters. So again, we don't probably need to worry too much about domains 1 and 2 because things haven't gone on so long that they would get hungry. And they're probably quite well looked after in terms of their physical environment. The water features are probably appropriate. But here we have to think about the other aspects. So the normal living experience of these animals, so they live in a really big social group, 400 animals, maybe that's not appropriate for goldfish, maybe there's social stress associated with that. And when they're in their normal environment, they don't have any opportunities to hide. They don't really have anything to do. So in domain 4, we might think that their agency is thwarted. And then in domain 5, they might experience something like boredom or anxiety or social stress, for example. If we think about the processes by which they become otter food in this case, we might have capture injuries because they're plucking 20 animals out of a tank of 400, so they could get injured by the net or by banging into the sides or other animals. And I saw some interesting questions in the chat about how I'd set this up. So that was on purpose, that they had their gills slit before being immersed in ice water. Probably not what you'd do in real life, but I wanted you guys to think about that component. So if their gills are slit and then they're sitting there on the bench before they get immersed in ice water for 2 or 3 minutes, it's possible that they could experience pain associated with the injury, and maybe breathlessness if they're not able to get oxygen out of the water with slit gills. So they would experience those negative feelings right up until the point that they lose consciousness, which is pretty quickly after they're immersed in the ice water. And actually everything after that doesn't matter because they are not conscious anymore. So we might conclude for these guys in this scenario that their normal life is not that great. They don't have opportunities for positive experiences really. They might have good health and lower stress capture, which might be good. Maybe the end is quicker and better than being eaten by an otter. It's relatively quick, a couple of minutes before loss of consciousness might be assumed, and they don't have to feel fear and anxiety associated with transport and with the predator chasing them. So what you'll notice there is that we're trying to compare apples and oranges, and that's one of the challenges of welfare assessment, which I will touch on briefly in a couple of minutes. So if you did something wildly different or you want to talk about something, we can do that when we get to the Q&A, but we better push on now because I'm running a little bit late. So what I want to talk about briefly here is something that you may have been challenged by, and it's actually something that we clarified in the latest version of the model because some of my zoo colleagues, particularly keepers who are really involved in enrichment, really struggled with. So the problem that people were having is that they felt the need to put all the behavioral indicators, so anything that was behavior related, they felt that they needed to put it in domain 4. And that's because in the last iterations of the model, domain 4 was called behavior. So they might have been seeing pain behavior, or they might have been seeing food-seeking behavior, and so really wanted to put the evidence for that in domains 3 or domain 1 if it was food-seeking behavior, but felt like they needed to put all the behavior stuff in domain 4. So because of that confusion, we really needed to clarify what domain 4 is, and particularly we need to clarify how it compares to domain 2, which is about the physical environment. So some of this I've kind of touched on already, but domain 4 is really where you would put evidence about the animal's interactions with its environment, with other animals, and with humans. And as I said before, really the behavioral indicators that we're interested here are the ones that reflect that conscious, goal-related, motivated behavior. So the behaviors that are about the animal's agency, doing what it really wants to do. And the behaviors that we look at that go in domain 4 are the ones that really reflect the animal's perception of or its interactions with its external environment. So I really love the picture of the cat here, which shows this animal really engaged, really expressing its agency, showing behavior that's strongly motivated, in this case, a hunting behavior. But it also might be a strong motivation to interact with other animals like we see in the other picture. When we put behaviors into domain 4, when we go over to domain 5, the mental experiences that are associated with those are what we call situation-related affects. So remembering affects are just mental experiences that are important to the animal. And here's where we think about if the animal is able to achieve its goals and be rewarded through its expression of those behaviors, then it's likely to have positive experiences. And if it is unable to express those behaviors because of some feature of the environment, there's not enough room or there's nothing to interact with, there are no other animals, then it's likely to have negative experiences. If we compare that to what's going on in domain 2, this is where people were getting a bit confused and they weren't really sure where to put things. One thing that's important to note is it actually doesn't matter where you put them. As long as you put them somewhere and as long as you interpret them carefully in terms of the specific mental experiences. And as long as you only put them in one place, then it actually doesn't matter too much. But just for clarification, the kinds of things that we would put in domain 2 are really more about what's going on inside the animal's body, its physiological status, because of what it's been exposed to in the environment. So in domain 4, it was really about the ability to express agency in its interactions with the environment. Here, it's really about how the physical environment has influenced the animal's body stability. So in domain 2, we're really looking for evidence that there's been some kind of disturbance to homeostasis or to the body's internal stability. So that might be that sugar levels are too low. It might be that body temperature is too high. It might be that there's not enough fluid in the body. And so the animal expresses behavior, but also physiological responses to try and restore that stability or to maintain that body stability. When we follow over from domain 2, and this is actually the same for domains 1 and 3 usually, the mental experiences we talk about here are often what we call survival critical affects. So that's in contrast to domain 4, where we follow over to situation related affects. And you can think about these survival critical affects as being kind of warnings that say to the animal, oh, something's going wrong inside of you, and you need to do something about it. So you need to express a behavior, or there needs to be a physiological change to bring things back to normal inside of the body. So the kinds of things we think about there are thirst, to motivate the animal to drink, air hunger or breathlessness, to try and escape from whatever that problem is or fight off whatever's stopping you from breathing, pain, to deal with an injury, and so on. I'm just a little bit aware of time, so I'm just going to go through this relatively quickly, but I just want to make the point that many of you will be aware of another way of thinking about animal welfare. Obviously, there are some similarities. There are 5 freedoms and there are 5 domains, and the 5 freedoms has been around for a long time and has been really useful in some ways. But really what we're thinking now is that the 5 domains model is more useful for our purposes in terms of scientific and detailed assessment of animal welfare. And just quickly to go through some of the reasons that we think that the 5 domains is more useful for our specific purposes compared to the 5 freedoms. So as the name suggests, and this is actually not what the 5 freedoms was originally designed to do, but this is really what happens most of the time. The 5 domains allows us to recognize degrees of welfare compromise or enhancement, whereas the freedoms kind of makes people think in absolute terms. So this idea that it's ideal for animals to be free of all negative experiences. Unfortunately, that's not really realistic, and in fact, in some situations, it's actually not desirable. So if we go back to this one for a moment, if animals don't have these survival critical affects, things like thirst and hunger, then they won't eat and they won't drink. If they don't have pain, they won't protect their injured part of their body, and they won't avoid danger in the future. So there are actually some unpleasant experiences that are necessary for survival, and we don't want animals to be free per se of some of those. We want them to be free of chronic or really intense versions of those negative experiences. The other thing about the 5 domains is it allows us to keep up to date with our evidence and our sort of understanding of welfare and the science behind it. The 5 freedoms doesn't really allow us to keep evolving our thinking. And you can see over 25 years that the 5 domains has changed quite a lot. The 5 freedoms also doesn't really give us an opportunity and doesn't really give us guidance on how we can provide opportunities for positive experiences for animals. So freedom to express normal behaviors it's quite difficult to figure out how we can do that. But if we can think about the kinds of experiences that we might provide animals in terms of you know, safety or companionship, that gives us a guide on how we can give animals opportunities for positive experiences. And we have to be careful with this normal behavior stuff, because there are actually lots of normal behaviors that reflect negative experiences that we actually don't want animals to have. So pain behavior is a really good example. And finally, the 5 domains model has wider applicability. So the 5 freedoms was designed to look at the effects of husbandry procedures on livestock animals, and it's not widely applicable. So just as an example, not very useful for assessing the welfare of free living wild animals, because if they are free of all of these things, they will die really quickly. So the 5 freedoms works in lots of different situations. And we kind of conclude that the 5 freedoms is really useful for the public for kind of indicating the different areas of welfare that we need to think about, but it's not really that useful for those of us who want to do really detailed scientifically sort of supported evaluations. So quickly to go through the advantages, and many of these I've covered already. So the thing that I really like about the 5 domains, I'm a real systems thinker. I like to make sure that I've ticked everything off and I haven't forgotten anything. And the 5 domains is really useful for that. So it encourages us to look for a wider range of both impacts and benefits, so negative and positive experiences. And it also encourages us not to just focus on one, for example, pain, which is one that we tend to get a bit hung up on. And it also sort of moves us away from this thing of distress, which we really don't know what it is and we really don't know how to fix it. So it forces us to be a little bit more specific, and then we can look for ways to fix problems that arise for our animals. This one's really important. So the 5 domains, because of the structure where we have our evidence in the 4 physical domains, and then we are really forced to look at what that means to the animal in terms of its mental experiences in the 5th domain, it means that we are always thinking about what does this mean to the animal. And that can be really useful in lots of different situations. So it can help us think about, well, how significant is this thing to the animal? And it can help us understand the implications of our decisions. So if we're deciding to go for kind of heroic treatments, well, what's it like to be that animal? If we're deciding to breed animals that we know probably are functionally impaired, what's it like to be that animal? And if we're making decisions about treating or not treating, or ending life or not ending life, then we have to think about what does it mean to the animal. The other thing that's really great about the model is that it forces us to be transparent. So we have to lay down our evidence in front of people who are looking, and they have to see justification of how we've come to the conclusion that the animal is bored, or that it's in pain, or that it's hungry, because we've actually laid our evidence out and then made our cautious inference about that experience. And that's great because it protects us from criticisms of anthropomorphism, because there's the evidence and you can make your decision on the basis of what I've laid out. This one's pretty simple, so it encourages us not only to look at mitigating negative experiences or avoiding them, but also to always be seeking opportunities for positive experiences. And I know that the zoo community is all over that, so it's something that you guys do just as a matter of course, but it's a really useful thing to be reminded of in other situations as well. The model is really versatile, and this kind of goes back to the comparison to the 5 domains. So it's really applicable to any species of animal and situation, with the caveat that you have to have clear evidence that your animal actually has the capacity to experience breathlessness or fear or whatever it is. And you can look at their welfare in a range of different situations. It allows you to evaluate something that you might be thinking about doing beforehand, so doing kind of a theoretical desk-based assessment. It allows you to design targeted solutions for problems that you think are going on, and you can actually evaluate afterwards the effects of any interventions that you put in place. And then this is what you guys have actually just done. So the model allows, as long as you're careful, it allows grading of different options or alternatives, and you can actually come up with relative rankings of the different options you have. So you might have come out of the otter goldfish situation thinking absolutely you can keep feeding goldfish to otters because they have a great life just until right at the end, or you might have said no, it's too terrible to be chased by an otter, and it would be better to actually have a sort of a boring life and not be killed by an otter at the end. So people can select from different alternatives. That they can select what we kind of were talking about the other day, which is the least bad, and hopefully as things improve you can go for the most good. And I just wanted to show you a quick example of how we did this. So this was an assessment we did of different poisons used to kill possums in New Zealand. And one of the things I want to point out here is that in domains 1 to 4, which you'll see on the left-hand side there, and we have 3 poisons down the far left, We used a range of scores, so we didn't use numbers. We used from no right through to extreme to give a grading to each of the impacts that we thought the animals experienced in domains 1 to 4. In domain 5, in the middle there, you'll see we've actually delineated all the different experiences that we think the animals had, and we give a range of confidence scores. So if you look at the top line there, we were very confident. We gave a confidence score of 3 that those animals who were killed using cyanide would experience breathlessness. We use that information to come up with overall impact scores, and again, these are not numerical. We use words, and I'll tell you why in a moment, and then we looked at how long those experiences lasted. So we could come up with a relative grading, and you'll see in this case the grade is actually a number, but it's really important to be careful about numbers because this is number 1 on the limitations. So we try usually to stay away from using numbers or trying to quantify welfare impacts. This is really because these assessments they're qualitative in nature. If we use numbers, it suggests that we are precise to a level that we just can't be. So these are rough assessments, as all welfare assessments are. And the other reason that we want to stay away from numbers is because they encourage people to do kind of weird things like adding or subtracting or averaging. And there really is no justification for doing those kinds of mathematical operations on welfare scores. So we try and stay away from them. If you look back at this slide here, you can see that we've come up with this. There was a matrix which was the impact and the duration, and we came up with these overall grades. But it's really important to note that just because cyanide got a 4 and brodifacoum got an 8, it doesn't mean that brodifacoum is twice as bad as cyanide. And that's why we generally try and stay away from numbers, because they suggest things that we can't justify. The other limitation of the model, and this is really a limitation of all welfare assessments, is it doesn't address the comparison of qualitatively different experiences. So you just saw that in the goldfish example. We might have had breathlessness and pain in one example versus boredom or frustration in the other. And it's really up to the user after the assessment is done to make a judgment about what is the best or the least bad option of those available. So the model doesn't do that for you, and in fact, no models really do. The other thing is that the model is really best for what we call point in time analysis. So it's really good for saying, okay, here's a snapshot of the situation. We can do an assessment on that. It's not so good for doing quality of life assessment, where you're looking to kind of accumulate all of the mental experiences the animal has over a long period in its life. It just doesn't really lend itself very well to that kind of assessment. And we've also found that it's most useful for individual animal assessment. You can do group or population level assessments with it, but you kind of have to come up with a decision beforehand about what you're assessing. So you might be assessing the best case scenario or the worst case scenario or some kind of average, or you might come up with a range for the population. But it does tend to be best for individual animals. So the last thing I just want to point out very briefly before we finish up and get on to questions is that in the last version of the model, which was published last year, we've really been explicit about how animals interact with other animals and particularly with humans and the impacts of those interactions on the animal's welfare. So this picture just shows an excerpt from domain 4. Up above it were interactions with the environment and interactions with other animals, and this is just the bit about interactions with humans. And so we know that human presence and the way that people behave can influence animals' behavior and their physiology and therefore their welfare. And we use the indicators, the behavior and the physiology to tell us about what those interactions mean to the animal's welfare. So we've always done this in the model, but it's kind of been a bit of a brief hand wave and you figure it out yourself. And now in the latest version of the model, it's much more explicit and much more detailed. So just to give you a couple of examples, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but these are just categories of interactions that people can have with animals. You can look back over them afterwards. These are ones that I've put in that are specific to wild or captive wild animals. And so they're specific situations where animal-human interactions could lead to unpleasant experiences and compromise of animal welfare. And I want to just point out the one at the bottom, because it's a little bit interesting and sometimes people forget about this one. So this is where you might have a person who's bonded with the animal whose actions cause unintended harm. So this might be if you have developed a really close relationship with a particular individual animal, and then you leave your job, or it might be your dog, and every day you go off to work and leave dog behind, although I know nobody's doing that because you're all staying home now. And this can cause unintended negative experiences for the animal. Or it might be, again, going back to that failing to treat an animal's injury or illness, or failing to make an end-of-life decision. If we look at positive experiences, again, we've got a whole range there. And if we just go down to the bottom again, then there are opportunities for people to create positive experiences, or at least alleviate or end negative experiences for animals through their actions. So we might think about a vet treating injury or sickness, relieving negative experiences, or freeing an animal from a barren or a restricted environment might lead to positive experiences. Okay, so I've gone a little over time, so we better wrap up. Just to the take-home messages. So this model has been around for about 25 years and it's changed over that period. We feel confident now to ascribe a whole range of mental experiences to animals, both negative and positive. Remember that we use the evidence that we compile in the 4 physical domains to carefully infer the mental experiences that we put in the 5th domain, and we need to be quite specific about what those mental experiences are. Hopefully I've given a bit of clarification about domains 2 versus 4. We feel for a range of reasons that the 5 domains is more suitable for scientific assessment than the 5 freedoms, although the 5 freedoms has done lots of great stuff in the public sphere particularly. The 5 domains is really great because it's systematic, it's more comprehensive, we have to look more broadly at what's going on with the animals. It's transparent, so we can justify our conclusions and our decisions. It's versatile, and it allows us to come up with relative rankings. But we do have to be aware that it provides only qualitative information. It's best for individual animals, and it's really best for point-in-time assessments. And if you're particularly interested in human-animal interactions, then go and read the 2020 paper in Animals, which is free for everybody online. And it gives some really good guidance and detail about how you can look at the way that the proximity and behavior of humans can impact on animal welfare. And that's all about domain 4. So I just want to thank Sally, and also I'd like to thank our tech support today. Thank you so much for making everything work. Sandrine, and I'd like to thank co-authors of recent papers applying the 5 domains, the zoo community for all the amazing work that you do, and I'd really like to thank everybody for coming along and putting up with me for a little bit longer than you were supposed to tonight. So thank you very much, and I'll just leave that up in case anybody's interested, but you can ask me for copies of these or get most of them online. So that's me. Have we got any questions?
Thank you very much, Ngaio. Thank you very, very much. We do have a lot of questions. They've been flying in, so apologies to everyone if I don't get to you, but I will do my best. So I would like to ask, please, and apologies for the name pronunciations, Basil von R to unmute himself and ask a question, please.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for this great talk. It was really interesting. I just wanted to know, how would you use this model on geriatric animals? I think that's a problem arising in many, many zoos all over the world. The longer the time passes, because husbandry gets better and better in many species. And it's always hard to find the right time to euthanize an animal. For example, if you have an old individual who shows arthrosis, how do you weigh all the negative impacts that keep growing and growing until the point where you actually say, well, the welfare is definitely deprived, and it would be better to be euthanized?
Yeah. I mean, that's an excellent question. And I think any model can only go so far in answering that question. And ultimately, it ends up being a judgment by the people who know the animal best. But you can use the model to do repeated assessments and really look for changes. And I think one of the benefits of the model for that particular situation is that you can look at the balance of negative and positive experiences the animal's likely to be having. So as you indicated, you're likely to get an accumulation or an intensification of some of those unpleasant experiences, like, arthritic pain. and functional impairment, can't do things, can't jump up anymore. And I guess the part that's useful is that you can look at the animal no longer taking advantage of opportunities to have positive experiences. So you might be offering opportunities for some kind of feeding related enrichment, and the animal's saying, no, I don't want to do it anymore. So there's not an easy answer to that, but I think repeated assessments over time and looking for the shift in the balance where you're getting more negative than positive, and they're not in a situation where they can take advantage of those opportunities for positives anymore.
Well,
I don't know that makes it easier.
Yeah, well, no, it does, because usually we tend to look only at like pain, and then especially in arthrosis, you just can give some pain meds and then everything is fine, but it's not. Okay.
No, it's not, and we know that. And so, yeah, I think focusing really on what are the good things that this animal still has to live for. And we do the same thing for our companion animals, and it's so difficult. And I know that various zoos have sort of guidelines, and the zoo that I work with, it's very interesting because we developed these guidelines for end-of-life decision making, and sort of had this naive expectation that the team would use those to make the decision, and they didn't. They went with intuition, and afterwards they used the tool to actually debrief and to sort of come to terms with their decision. So that was really interesting.
Oh, cool. Yeah. No, that helped a lot. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for the question. That's a really good one.
Sure. Thank you very much. And could I now ask Natalia Guseva to unmute yourself and ask your question tomorrow, please? Do we have Natalia?
She's gone home.
She's finished. Okay. Alexandre, are you there? If you could unmute yourself, please.
Yes, I am. Good morning from Portugal.
Hello, welcome.
Okay, so thank you for the great talk. What I would like to ask is when we're inferring about the effects of these stimuli on animals, whether it would make a difference that the stressor is something that the animal has co-evolved to cope with, like being chased by an otter, or not, something different, something that he's never encountered.
Yeah.
Would this change our inference?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question, and it's the sort of natural normal bit is very confusing. It muddies the waters, and so I would argue that it probably doesn't influence your inference, because things like anxiety and fear are survival mechanisms to avoid danger. And so just because the animal is evolved with a predator doesn't mean that it's not sensible to still feel those unpleasant experiences to motivate escape behaviors, for example. Having said that, I was speaking to somebody the other day who had a totally different take on it and said, well, many animals go into a state of sort of shock or unresponsiveness when they are near or captured by predators, and they're unlikely to experience any fear or pain during that period before they're dispatched by the predator. And now I don't know for which animals that's true, if any, and so really the onus is on people to have a look and see what the evidence is. So, you know, there are experiments that will support, well, yeah, this animal's stress hormones went through the roof, so it probably was experiencing some kind of negative feeling as it's being chased by the otter. Good luck getting ethics approval to do that research these days, but they did do those kinds of studies in the past. I remember there was a study looking at quail being predated by cats, and they were looking at, what do they call it? Death feigning or tonic immobility, and looking at whether when the animal was in that behavioral state, was it actually terrified? And yes, it was. So yeah, I'm not convinced that naturalness actually changes what the mental experience will be, but I'm quite willing to be convinced otherwise if you have evidence to contradict
Not
that.
at all. The only thing that I was thinking was maybe the difference between having a co-evolved response or just the sense of helplessness. But then we'd be comparing maybe two different affective states, fear and anxiety versus fear, anxiety, and helplessness. I don't know. It's really hard to.
Excellent point. Excellent point. And then I guess the question is about prior experience. So if you've never experienced being chased by an otter, is it more frightening than if you've been chased by an otter, you know, in the past? So I don't know. Excellent question. Thank you. Has anyone got an easy question now?
Thank you very much. I'd like to move now to Miguel Freitas. If you could unmute yourself, please.
Hello.
Hello, welcome.
Yes, I am from Pakistan. Good afternoon, according to Pakistan.
I'm sorry. Excuse me. That question was for Miguel Freitas, please. Thank you.
Hello. Hi, Sally. Hi, everyone. Well,
hello. Welcome.
How are you? My question was related to the that essay that we tried to do in the terms of comparing scenario A and B of the goldfish. Since in one of the scenarios it was a 400 goldfish tank, if it could be considered as well in terms of a nutrition, that the increase of competition when the goldfish is trying to get their food resources, it might be a little bit, or consider like a negative impact when you compare it in a goldfish that live in a tank of only 20 elements. The access for food resources will be much easier than the other scenario.
That is an excellent point. Absolutely. And I mean, that's what's fantastic, is that you've taken more out of it than I did and you know what to do with it. So I think that's brilliant. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we have a question from Sarah Sakira, also along the lines with regards to your scenarios.
Hi, yeah, so my question was, given the otters and goldfish scenario you gave us, what if the otters were part of a conservation program, including a reintroduction into the wild? My question is, for me it would, but the question is for you, and I guess for everyone else, wouldn't that change the weight or the value we put on the welfare of the goldfish, since the otters would need to learn the feeding skills, the hunting skills in order to survive in the wild? So my question is that wouldn't the context also change the weight we put on the welfare of the fish in this case? Thank you.
Yep. Okay, great. So yes, but what we need to do is we need to be really clear about the welfare assessment and then the weight that we give it. So what we were doing in that exercise was simply assessing the welfare implications for the goldfish, and that information can then be integrated into a broader decision-making exercise where you are bringing in all of those other elements. So the enrichment for the otters, obviously chasing a fish around is so much more fun and engaging than just eating a dead fish that's, you know, dropped into your tank. And like you say, there might be a whole range of other reasons why, but we have to have a clear understanding of what the welfare impacts are for each of the animals involved, so that we have the full picture and we can justify the decisions we make. So I would argue that the context doesn't change our welfare assessment, but it changes what we do with the outcomes of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Makes perfect
Brilliant.
sense. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we're going to squeeze one more question in from Sam Ward, please. Thank you very much.
Hello there. I was really interested about the point that you made about the animals' evaluation in the wild, and I'm just intrigued as to, you know, if you did discover that there was a welfare concern, what point or at what stage would you potentially intervene, or would you, you know? That's the, yeah.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Oh, I mean, that's, Sam, thank you. That's a fantastic question. And it's also, again, one that the model itself can't answer. but it can provide information to inform the decision making. And that's in fact when Andrea Harvey used the model over the last few years to assess the welfare of the Brumbies in Australia. That information was quite revealing and had quite significant impacts on the decision making that followed for those horses. Yeah, that's next level. I mean, there are not only the welfare impacts to consider, but all of, you know, things like economic decisions and what people want to do, what people want to believe, and being able to present a justified, scientifically supported and transparent welfare assessment can help, because it isn't just based on what people think's going on. You can actually say, well, here's the strength of the evidence we have to support this, the welfare outcome of what's going on. So yeah, if you have an answer to that, please let me know. I don't know the answer to that one.
I suppose this is where the kind of, you know, ethics and welfare kind of intertwine a little bit. We can find the information about all of the welfare implications and the measures, but yeah, what we then do with that information is then the ethical side of things.
Absolutely. And lots of times we do the welfare assessment and then everybody ignores what it says and does what they, you know, either what they intuitively felt they wanted to do already, or, you know, we still kill lots of animals using the worst poisons available in New Zealand for a whole range of reasons. So, you know, the anticoagulants, the bleeding poisons come out as the worst of the ones available, and they are still the most commonly used poisons for rodents and possums in New Zealand because they're safe for people and they're economic and they're easy to distribute, etc. So
yeah, brilliant. Thank you, great talk.
Yeah, thanks, Sam.
So I will call it there for questions. Thank you very much. A huge thank you, Ngaio, for your talk. We had loads of questions, and I'm sure people are going to want to watch that webinar again, which will be available via our EAZA YouTube channel and via the website. So thank you very much.
Can I just say, Sally, if people want to send me an email, I'm very happy to answer questions that we didn't get to because I went too long. So please do send me an email, and I'd love to get back to people.
That's really kind, thank you. So if people send me the email, and then I'll facilitate them onto you, Ngaio, is that okay? And I'll put my email into the chat for anyone who would like to send their questions on. Thank you very much, Ngaio. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Now, can I ask you to move on to the final slide, please? Can you hear me, Ngaio?
Sorry, I missed that.
Could I ask you to move on to the final slide, please?
Yep.
Thank you. So thank you very much, Ngaio. That was really wonderful. Thank you. And we've had some brilliant comments and lots of questions. And thank you to everybody for joining us from all over the world. We would like to extend our thanks also to IFAW, the International Fund for Animal Welfare, once more for making these webinars possible, and to Sandrine Camus for the EAZA Executive Office behind the scenes. We have 2 more webinars that are scheduled, so please do join us for those. Sandrine has already put the registration links into the chat. We have with Dr. Isabella Clegg, who's going to be focusing on taking your welfare programme to the next level, using her Seawell Dolphin assessment as an example, and the Animal Care Software's cloud-based welfare platform. So even if you're not directly involved with dolphins, this is still a really useful tool and can be used for any animals. And also then we have Dr. Sally Sherwin from Zoos Victoria, who's going to be looking at people, animal welfare and conservation and aligning key priorities in the zoo. There's some really, really good messaging in there about how to get everybody on the same page when moving forward with those kind of joint priorities and pillars of the modern zoo community. So thank you very much, and please do register for those. Don't forget to join us on the EAZA Animal Welfare Facebook page and check out our website for previous recordings of the webinars. Thank you very much for joining us today, and hopefully you will join us for the next webinar. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you, Ngaio.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.